Does it sound a bit heartless if people say, well, you know what, we shouldn't have airlifted people out of Sudan? Bear in mind, though, Benjamin, I mean, it's not just Sudan, is it? We are talking, of course, aren't we, about the idea that NHS data says 7 million people are on waiting lists for specialist clinical care. I mean, we've got also 66,195 people waiting longer than 62 days to start surgery last year, almost double the pre-COVID figure. Why are we helping out so many other people?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, charity, as it says, begins at home. You know, you need to take care of the people in your own country before you start trying to solve problems over the rest of the world. And you look at countries like, for example, India, who we give foreign aid money to. They've got a space program. What are we doing? Giving money to a country with a space program when you have people who can't pay their heating bills or afford to eat in this country. And I really do think it's time to reassess our priorities. Maybe foreign aid at one point was a great idea when the developing world was still, you know, desperately in need of it and we had plenty to give away. But as we get poorer and as they get richer, I think it might be time to reassess our policy.
I just wonder whether, Benjamin, we've been trying too long to have a foot in both camps, where we're giving foreign aid in dribs and drabs, roughly in the region of around 11 to 15 billion quid a year. But then, of course, on top of that, then, we're also not sending enough money for them to really sort out the problems that they've got in their own countries. So then we're also dealing with those problems back here at home as well, like we're seeing with the migrant crisis, for example. And then, of course, we then don't have all the money in the world to actually sort out our own infrastructure. It just feels like we need to do one thing or the other, doesn't it? We either send a load of money abroad and say, please sort your mess out, and then we don't have to deal with it, or we just put it all into our own infrastructure.
Yeah, completely. And one of the other problems of foreign aid is, you know, how much control do we have over where that money goes? How can we be certain that what we're giving it in for the intentions for is actually where it ends up? You know, a lot of the time, you know, when there's money around, there's always a little bit of people creaming off the top or whatever else. So it may very well be the case that we're sending all of this huge amounts of money and it's not going to address the problems that it's meant to. So, yes, it might be kind-hearted and well-meaning, but it's not very intelligent. But fundamentally, the point for me is that there are people struggling in this country. If we had solved every issue in Britain, then fine, go off and help the rest of the world. But whilst you have your own fellow countrymen starving and freezing and not able to pay their bills or their mortgage or their rent or get by, why are we sending billions of money, which we are taking from them? We are taxing it from those people who are struggling to send abroad. Yeah. I mean, it really is, I think, farcical.
Yeah, and also what I can't understand is the idea that this genuinely buys us loads of soft power. It doesn't. Africa is basically now essentially run by the Chinese government because they've pumped a huge amount more into infrastructure. We paid into the European Union massively for decades, and then we got absolutely nothing in return, essentially, when we left, and they don't particularly like us, and they've expected us to step up to the plate for Ukraine. And then we seem shocked, don't we, when we send some money over to some far-flung African dictator, and shock horror, not a lot of that money ends up in the mouths of poor people living in their country. It is totally self-defeating. And Benjamin, would it not just be a pretty cut-and-dry vote winner for someone to go, you see that massive NHS backlog there? You see the people who are dying on cancer wards because we can't give them enough treatment in enough time? Yeah, we're going to just give them the money, and we're not actually going to give it to some corrupt African despot of a nation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, we should be, it should go to our public services before it goes abroad, especially the ones that are struggling. But with the NHS, I think it's not just a case of throwing money at it. We do need to reform it root and branch so that we can be sure that that money is being spent properly and not being wasted. So, for example, in areas like procurement, we need to be ensuring that they are procuring equipment and supplies and whatnot from places where there is competitivity in the market and they're getting the best price, rather than, as we saw during lockdown, during the pandemic, we had these this procurement for PPE going to certain companies which were ramping up the prices, gouging. We wasted huge amounts of money on defunct or defective equipment which never got used. So we do need to be very clear that, yes, we should be putting this money into our public services in this country, but also we need to be sure that we're spending it properly.
What would you say, Benjamin, to the people who go, well, look, it's just a drop in the ocean. Things like foreign aid and everything else that comes out on top of it as well is just a drop in the ocean, and it would not solve our NHS crises, or it would not solve our education crisis and all of that stuff?
Well, maybe a drop in the ocean to politicians who think in figures of billions, not pounds and pence. But I think, if you can save one old person from freezing to death in their home, or you can feed one mouth in Britain, it's worthwhile, even if it is just a couple of billion to them. I think it's quite a lot to the people of this country who are struggling.
Yeah, and Benjamin, one final one with you, if that's all right. Do you think Britain is expected to be absolutely everything to all people, when actually maybe we can't quite have that at the moment? I was amazed by the articles there in Sudan about Sudan going, oh, Britain is so slow to act, we're not doing enough. Then you look at what was happening in Turkey, despite the fact that the British public donated millions, tens of millions of pounds out of their own pocket to go and help with that crisis. Oh, what's our government doing with the Turkish earthquake? Sorry, nothing. As far as I can tell, why? Why should we? It's not our earthquake, is it? And then at the same time, here at home, they're supposed to go, well, let's give people an above-inflation pay rise in the public sector. Let's give every single child free school meals. Let's do everything. I mean, where do people think all this money comes from?
Yeah, I think there's been a cognitive dissonance. We have this mentality of saying, Britain, it's terrible we ever had an empire, or whether it went abroad or did anything in other countries, we should stick to ourselves and let them get on with their own affairs. But also, whenever there's a problem, we've got to send them money. We've got to go there and help them. We've got to fix the crisis. I mean, which is it? Either we are involved globally with those countries, helping them and assisting them, or we are keeping to ourselves. But I do think people want it both ways. You can't have that. We want you when we've got a problem, but we don't want you the rest of the time. And I think that's the problem, really.